She was dismissed as a grease-stained nobody, a woman with oil on her face and silence in her steps. The men smirked as she crawled under the broken Humvee, tossing jokes like wrenches. But everything changed the moment a high-ranking colonel saw what she scribbled on the steel beneath. Not just numbers, but an encrypted spinal algorithm that could only come from one place, the classified core of military intelligence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. No one ever looked twice at Lena when she walked onto the base. If they did, it was with the kind of glance reserved for someone in the wrong uniform or at the wrong post. She wore coveralls 2 sizes too big, smeared with dust and engine grease, and her name tag was so faded it may as well have read Ghost. Most of the soldiers barely remembered her name. They called her the wrench girl, or that quiet chick in the motor pool, like she was an anonymous background fixture who'd been there forever and somehow never mattered. No one asked where she came from. No one asked what she knew. And Lena liked it that way. Or at least that's what she told herself every time they laughed a little too loud when she walked by, or tossed a sarcastic comment when she bent over an engine. That morning, like most others, she was in Bay 3, lying under a desert-battered Humvee that had been giving their logistics unit trouble for weeks. 3 mechanics had already failed to fix it. Most said the drivetrain was shot. Others blamed it on electronics interference from the new surveillance rigs they'd been testing. Lena didn't say a word. She just showed up 2 hours before shift, her toolbox in hand, and a folded sheet of paper tucked under her sleeve. She slid beneath the belly of the beast, brushing sand off the frame with the back of her gloved hand. Above her, voices echoed. Some familiar, others new. A visiting platoon had arrived late the night before, bringing with them fresh tension and louder skepticism. The new recruits clustered near the entrance, waiting for transport clearance, killing time by trading stories and spotting weirdos on base. She could hear them laughing, loud and unfiltered, like the walls weren't thin enough for words to travel. One of them joked about the tomboy mechanic with the sad eyes, and another chimed in with a fake southern drawl, "Bet she thinks she's building rockets down there." The words weren't new. Lena had learned to let them roll off like sweat. But that morning, something in her bones felt different. Like the dust in the air had teeth. Like the Humvee wasn't the only thing being held together by tension and screws. As her fingers traced the metal casing near the back axle, she reached into her coverall's chest pocket and pulled out a small strip of weathered tape. She pressed it against the underside of the chassis and carefully etched a string of characters with her grease pencil, lines, symbols, and coordinates that weren't part of any standard military repair manual. She drew them fast, methodically, then covered it again with another piece of protective sealant. To anyone else, it was a random cluster of maintenance notes. But if anyone had bothered to decode the placement of each line, the curve of each mark, they might have recognized it for what it was. A spinal alignment algorithm paired with encrypted spatial positioning, something usually seen only in covert drone systems or biomechanical targeting frameworks. But no one did. They just laughed again when she emerged from under the vehicle, her forehead streaked with grime, eyes unreadable. The new Corporal, Reyes, sneered as he tossed a bottle of water her way, purposely letting it roll past her hands. Lena didn't flinch. She grabbed her rag, wiped her hands, and walked to the side panel to log her notes. Somewhere on the far end of the garage, boots struck the concrete with sharp purpose. A hush fell over the chatter. A high-ranking officer had entered, flanked by aides. Colonel Matthew DeSanti, recently reassigned from overseas intelligence, was inspecting the fleet before they were rerouted to a classified desert op. He wasn't supposed to stop by the maintenance bays, but he had a habit of following his gut, and his gut told him that half the tech coming through was being patched with Band-Aids. He scanned the hangar, his eyes pausing at each rig until they landed on Bay 3 on Lena's Humvee. She stood aside, wiping her hands, not looking up. He walked past the others, ignoring the salutes and frozen bodies. Something had caught his eye. Maybe it was the odd way the Humvee's undercarriage had been sealed. Maybe it was the faint glimmer of code peeking from beneath a protective strip. Whatever it was, he knelt, reached under the vehicle, peeled back the tape, and stared. The men around him leaned in, confused. The colonel's face didn't change, but his hands paused. Then he stood slowly, turned, and asked the room who had worked on the Humvee last. Silence. Then a hesitant voice. Sir, that would be Calix, Lena Calix." He turned to her. "What's your clearance level?" Lena didn't speak, just stared back with those quiet, tired eyes. The colonel nodded once, then said the words that froze the room. "Get me her file. Now." That was the moment everything changed. No one laughed after that. Before she ever held a wrench, before she set foot on the sun-bleached asphalt of Outpost Camber 7, Lena Calix had been someone entirely different, someone who existed in the shadows of systems far more intricate than engines. But that part of her life was sealed in black ink, buried beneath layers of clearance only a few ever reached. What remained was the Lena everyone thought they knew, the woman in stained coveralls, barely speaking, always working, always alone. She moved through the base like a ghost assigned to grease and metal, her boots echoing in places others rarely lingered. Mechanics knew her only as competent. Officers rarely noticed her at all. And the new arrivals? They saw what they were conditioned to see. A quiet woman doing a man's job, with nothing to prove she belonged beyond the dirt on her hands. That perception never bothered Lena outwardly. She had mastered the art of invisibility, the delicate balance of being useful but forgettable. She arrived at dawn, long before the first coffee cups clinked in the mess hall, and she left after dark, when only the sentries and the desert wind remained. In between, she immersed herself in engines, transmissions, chassis schematics, mechanical languages that spoke more clearly than any conversation ever had. There was something comforting in the machinery. It didn't judge or gossip. It didn't mock or second guess. If something was broken, you either knew how to fix it or you didn't. There was no in-between. Her small dormitory was tucked away behind the utility barracks, far from the main bunks and common rooms. It was sparse, functional, just a narrow cot, a military-grade storage locker, and a compact desk that housed not makeup or photographs but blueprints, notebooks, and pages covered in symbols no one else on base could read. Symbols she wasn't supposed to write anymore. At night, she sometimes sat by the flickering light of her desk lamp, sketching imaginary systems with integrated spines and rotating neural arrays, imagining what it would have been like if things had gone differently, if she hadn't walked away from the program, if she hadn't disappeared beneath the radar. But those thoughts never stayed long. She chased them away with the sound of her soldering pen or the careful disassembly of a carburetor. Her appearance rarely changed. Her hair was always tied up in a low, tight knot, more practical than stylish. Her face bore the light freckling of sun exposure, and her eyes, a stormy mix of brown and gray, rarely made prolonged contact with others. She wore her uniform loose, not out of modesty, but because it helped people underestimate her. Let them think she was just a fixer. Let them smirk. It gave her space to breathe. But under that calm exterior, Lena was always calculating, always scanning, always anticipating the next move in a world she'd once helped design from the inside out. She hadn't always been this way. Years ago, before the Humvees and the mockery, she had worn a different uniform entirely, one with no nameplate and no public acknowledgement. She'd been selected for a program known internally as Lux 9, a fusion of biomechanics and AI targeting systems designed to integrate human spinal reflexes with field drone coordination. It was bleeding-edge tech, the kind that pushed ethical boundaries and demanded total commitment. Lena had excelled, not because she was the smartest, but because she could see patterns no one else could. While others memorized formulas, she felt systems move in her bones. She didn't just understand code, she internalized it. She became a conduit between machine and logic. But brilliance has a cost, especially in places where hierarchy and ego matter more than insight. The deeper Lena got into the program, the more she saw what others tried to ignore, the way research was twisted for control, the way innovation turned into surveillance, and how her algorithms were being weaponized far beyond their intended scope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When she questioned it, she was told to follow orders. When she resisted, she was marked as a risk, so she vanished. Not in the dramatic, gone with a trail of fire way, but quietly, strategically. She filed for reassignment, citing psychological fatigue. She shredded her access cards. And when she re-emerged 6 months later at Camber 7, no one recognized her. Her records had been altered. Her prior projects listed as classified or expunged. She was a blank slate with a wrench, and that's how she liked it. Until now. Because despite all her efforts to disappear into the grease and dust, something was shifting. The Humvee's internal routing system had triggered a memory, an echo of an old design she had worked on back in the lab. It had been experimental then, a hybrid guidance tech modeled after the curvature of the human spine. She'd left it unfinished, but when she saw the undercarriage of that vehicle, something clicked. That's why she drew it. That's why her fingers moved with certainty, etching code where bolts used to be. A reflex. A reckoning. She hadn't meant for anyone to see it, especially not someone like Colonel DeSanti. But fate, or maybe inevitability, had other plans. Now her quiet life of anonymity was at risk. The very past she'd buried beneath layers of steel and silence was clawing its way to the surface. And though she didn't yet know it, the spine coordinates she'd scrawled under that Humvee were more than just an echo. They were a map that could unravel everything. Or finally make it right. Outpost Camber 7 was the kind of place that wasn't on any tourist map, not even a digital one. Hidden somewhere between scorched canyons and endless miles of sand-choked nothingness, the base had long since stopped being about aesthetics. It was built for utility, for secrecy, for operations that never made headlines. Officially, it was designated as a logistics and transport support station. Unofficially, it was where failed projects went to be dismantled or quietly buried, along with the people associated with them. The air always carried a grainy dryness, like the wind had made a personal pact with the dust to coat every surface in a fine, itchy film. Camber 7 wasn't large by military standards, but it felt sprawling because of the distance between its units. Buildings weren't clustered for camaraderie. They were spaced out with deliberate intention, as if separation could contain whatever secrets each section held. There were 6 main zones: admin and personnel, living quarters, medical, drone testing range, tech depot, and mechanical bay. The last one was Lena's world. The mechanical bay was a steel cavern at the edge of the base perimeter, flanked by storage crates, stacked like concrete tombstones. Its sliding doors groaned open at 0500 hours and rarely shut until long after dark. Inside, rows of battered vehicles waited for salvation. Humvees with bullet-pocked doors, armored transports with sun-scorched panels, and prototype off-road units whose blueprints were still marked as experimental. Fluorescent lights flickered in the rafters above, casting everything in a sickly hue that flattened color and time alike. The scent was always the same: fuel, rust, sweat, and ozone. The kind of air that settled into your skin and stayed there no matter how hard you scrubbed. Workstations lined the walls, each assigned to a mechanic but used by anyone who needed a tool or a socket set. Order was maintained loosely, more out of mutual understanding than regulation. If you left something valuable out, you marked it. If you broke someone's rhythm with pointless chatter, you earned a glare. If you were new, you shut up and watched until someone told you what to do. Lena's corner was the furthest from the entrance, deliberately chosen. It was next to the junked drone carcasses, which meant fewer interruptions and more quiet. Over the years, she had turned her bench into a universe of small tools, faded schematics, and custom storage solutions that fit only her rhythm. On the wall above her desk hung three things: a faded schematic of an old powertrain system, a photo of an engine blueprint with no labels, and a rough hand-drawn diagram that most mistook for gibberish. None of the others knew it was actually a neural coordination mapping she'd built years ago, mimicking the nerve pathways in the spinal column. It was a relic of her past life, hung as a reminder, not of who she was, but of what she had to bury. Outside the bay, the rest of Camber 7 lived in uneasy cycles. The living quarters were minimalist and bare, long modular units lined with narrow beds and whisper-thin partitions. The mess hall served basic rations with flavorless efficiency. Conversations were few, and when they happened, they were measured, coded, and often loaded with subtext. No one talked about why they were stationed here for too long. Transfers came in quietly and left just as fast, often without goodbyes. The base was where reputations were either rebuilt from the ground up or left to decay unnoticed. You didn't end up in Camber 7 unless someone somewhere had decided you were easier to manage when removed from the spotlight. Still, not everything about the place was bleak. The desert surrounding the base had its own brutal beauty. During early mornings, the sky cracked open with slashes of gold and purple, and the silhouettes of distant ridges looked almost sacred. At night, the stars hung low and crowded, so dense and bright that Lena often found herself staring up at them during her late walks, letting the silence soak through her skin. Sometimes she wondered if anyone else noticed how the landscape seemed to hum with secrets, as if the sand itself remembered things people wanted to forget. The culture of the base was survivalist, and everyone knew their role. The commanding officers kept to themselves, emerging only when something failed or needed covering up. The field teams trained with robotic efficiency, their interactions built on habit rather than trust. New personnel were tested quickly, not through formal hazing, but through microaggressions, side comments, and the simple brutality of being ignored. Lena had passed that test not by enduring it, but by absorbing it until it had no more power. The less attention she drew, the freer she was to do her work unnoticed. But beneath the routines and protocols, Camber 7 had begun to shift. The arrival of Colonel DeSanti had stirred something. He wasn't like the other commanders. He was sharper, quieter, and more prone to wander unannounced. Rumor had it he'd worked with Tier 1 units in Black Ops divisions overseas, and that he had once led a shutdown operation on a rogue AI weapons platform. People said he could see through deception like glass, which made Lena uneasy, not because she had something to hide. She had everything to hide, but because the moment someone looked too close, they'd see what she'd spent years covering with engine grease and indifference. What no one realized was that Outpost Camber 7, for all its dust and disrepair, was sitting on the edge of something it couldn't contain. And Lena Calix, the woman most had dismissed as a background extra, was the last person standing between what had been buried and what would soon come rising back to the surface. The machines weren't the only things waiting to be fixed. Some designs, once drawn, couldn't be erased. And some places, like Camber 7, were never just holding zones. They were pressure cookers, built to test what survived the heat. The laughter always echoed the loudest when Master Sergeant Kyle Bren was in the room. His voice was rough from too many years barking orders and not enough years listening. He was the kind of man who had made a career out of being loud, broad-shouldered, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. To the newer recruits, he was a badge of survival, someone who could show them how to blend in, how to make themselves useful, how to avoid stepping on landmines of rank and politics. But to those who'd been around longer, Bren was a warning label on legs. His authority was not earned through brilliance or innovation, but through endurance, manipulation, and the quiet sabotage of anyone who posed a threat to the fragile pecking order he had built around himself. In a place like Camber 7, Where morale was already a ghost and routine was the only thing holding men together, Bren had carved out his power by becoming the gatekeeper of respect. He knew how to spin stories, how to use humor as a weapon, and most of all, how to humiliate without ever leaving a mark. His specialty was targeting those who didn't play the game, those who kept their heads down, not because they were shy, but because they were different. That made Lena his favorite kind of target. Bren had taken notice of her early on, not because of anything she did wrong, but because of what she refused to do. She didn't smile at his jokes. She didn't engage in the back-and-forth banter that passed as bonding. She didn't defer to him when he made decisions in the bay that ignored safety protocols or cut corners. And worst of all, she didn't crumble when he pressed. She just stood there, quiet, efficient, impossible to provoke. To a man like Bren, that wasn't humility. It was a challenge. So he started slow. He reassigned her tool access privileges, citing inventory discrepancies. He made a point of accidentally reassigning vehicles she was in the middle of repairing. He arranged group briefings where she was the only one not invited. Every time someone raised a question about Lena's abilities, Bren was there to offer a casual shrug and a smirk. She's good with engines, sure. Quiet, too. Maybe a little too quiet. He'd tilt his head just enough to imply something darker, something suspicious. And even if no one believed it entirely, the seed was planted. He didn't need to prove she was a threat. He just needed to make her seem like an anomaly. And in a place like Camber 7, where routine and conformity were lifelines, anomalies were distractions at best and liabilities at worst. His latest campaign had escalated just days before the Humvee incident. After Lena had successfully overhauled a retrofitted utility crawler that had stumped 3 senior techs, Bren made sure her report was, quote, accidentally overwritten in the database. When she brought it up to admin, the request was pending review. The accolades for the fix went to another mechanic, one of Bren's favored guys, and Lena said nothing. She returned to her bench, as always, and kept working. But that silence made Bren uneasy, because he didn't know what she was thinking. And men like Bren feared what they couldn't predict. What he also didn't know, what very few did, was that Bren had a secret of his own. Before he found his comfort zone in mid-level command, he'd been stationed at a remote intelligence facility in the Arctic corridor. It was a brief assignment, classified and sealed, but rumors swirled around those who dug too deep. Whispers said he had been involved in the failed integration of human interface technology, a project shelved after 3 personnel suffered neurological damage. One of the lead engineers had gone missing soon after. No one ever confirmed whether Bren had anything to do with it, but his sudden transfer and quiet promotions afterward painted a telling picture. That's what made his hatred for Lena more than just personal. Somewhere, deep in his subconscious, something about her unnerved him. Maybe it was the way she moved with precision instead of hesitation. Maybe it was the way she ignored him, like a man who no longer mattered. Or maybe it was the flicker of recognition he felt when he once glanced at her notes and saw a pattern he thought had been buried forever. Whatever it was, Bren had no intention of letting her rise above the surface. He began pressuring the officers to limit her assignments. He filed performance flags in the system under the guise of team disharmony and non-collaborative tendencies. He even started whispering doubts into the ears of the new colonel, planting seeds before DeSanti had a chance to form his own opinions. "You'll want to keep an eye on Calix," he said casually one afternoon during an inspection. "She's got a talent for showing up where she doesn't belong." But DeSanti wasn't like the others. He listened, but he didn't nod. He took notes, but his eyes told a different story. He didn't seem moved by gossip or small politics. And when the Humvee incident happened, when DeSanti saw those etched coordinates under the frame, he didn't ask Bren for his opinion. He asked for Lena's file. Directly. Publicly. That small moment, just a flicker in time, undid something in Bren. For the first time in years, his authority had been bypassed, his whisper campaign ignored, and that terrified him. So he doubled down. The following morning, Lena arrived to find her access to half the mechanical bay restricted due to a security update. Her tool locker had been moved. The assignment board no longer listed her name next to critical repairs. And word was quietly spreading that she was being investigated for unauthorized modifications to military property. It was a manufactured scandal, of course. But Bren knew how to spin stories. He didn't need facts, he just needed time. Time to discredit her before whatever DeSanti had seen could be fully understood. But Lena wasn't the same as the others he'd crushed. She didn't panic, she didn't run, she didn't plead her case. She just started walking with a different posture, a quiet confidence that no longer cared about hiding. Because she knew something Bren didn't. She knew that the algorithm under that Humvee was more than just a code. It was a key. And once it was seen, it couldn't be unseen. The days bled into each other at Camber 7, not because they were identical, but because the cycle of tension and silence had become a ritual of its own. Every morning at 0500, the metal groan of the motor bay doors echoed through the compound like a mechanical yawn. By 0515, Lena Calix would already be inside, hands deep in a half-disassembled transport unit or scanning through repair manifests with the same silent focus that had become her armor. She didn't rush, didn't dawdle, just moved with that unspoken rhythm of someone who had built her entire existence around being both invisible and indispensable. But even before Colonel DeSanti had arrived and seen what others had ignored, there had been a pattern at play, an unspoken choreography between Lena and the base that both protected and punished her. It began with the jobs no one else wanted. When a sand-locked axle wouldn't rotate no matter how many hands pulled at it, or when a sensor matrix went dead and diagnostics returned no fault, the others would eventually shrug and point toward the corner where Lena worked. "Let the wrench girl take it," they'd say with false nonchalance. And she always did. Not because she owed them, but because broken things whispered to her in ways people never could. She'd approach them quietly, tools in hand, silence in her wake, and within hours, sometimes even minutes, systems would hum back to life like obedient machines remembering their purpose. They never thanked her. They barely acknowledged the results. Once, when a fire control console in a surveillance vehicle glitched out during a live test, causing a delay in classified exercises, it was Lena who restructured the internal circuitry using salvaged components not meant for that model. The vehicle went live in record time. The report was signed off by Sergeant Bren's chosen tech, who had been supervising from the break room. Lena received no credit, not even a nod. But she didn't contest it. She returned to her corner, to her station between the crates and forgotten drone parts, and resumed her work like nothing had happened. The pattern continued. She would solve, they would claim. She would fix, they would forget. And over time, her presence became an anomaly. People accepted, but didn't respect. Some even called it a superstition, like an old mechanic's myth. Leave it long enough, and Calix will sort it out. That was the running joke. Except it wasn't a joke. It was a ritual built on exploitation, passively accepted by the very system that kept her hidden. And in some ways, Lena allowed it. Because the anonymity it granted her served a higher purpose. As long as no one was asking who she really was, she could breathe. As long as they were looking past her, she could look deeper into things that mattered. She had files of her own, blueprints she reconstructed from memory, systems she observed in secret, vehicles modified in small, precise ways that no one else noticed. But Bren noticed the results, and it frustrated him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Every time he tried to box her in with regulation or bureaucracy, she slipped through by simply doing what no one else could. When he diverted parts from her requisitions, she crafted what she needed from scrap. When he reassigned her to lower priority maintenance, she found critical flaws in equipment others had already cleared. Even when he isolated her from other mechanics, she worked faster, cleaner, and more efficiently than teams twice her size. Her refusal to break, Her quiet, impenetrable resilience had become a constant itch beneath Bren's skin. He began creating interruptions, assigning rookies to assist her with no experience, just to slow her down, reassigning projects midway through her repairs so others could finish and claim the outcome. At one point, he tried to frame her for improper calibrations on a signal jammer, submitting a falsified inspection report. But when the colonel ordered a surprise retest, the system performed flawlessly, better than spec actually, and Bren had to feign surprise while Lena stood a few feet away, unreadable as ever. Despite it all, Lena kept returning to her bench, to the corner she had claimed not with authority, but with consistency. There, beneath a cluster of rusted drone wings and half-dismantled transaxles, she maintained her own ritual, scribbling in a notebook wrapped in layers of tape and sealed with a magnetic lock. The pages were filled not with maintenance notes, but with intricate diagrams, curved coordinates that mimicked spinal networks, encrypted sequences that followed no mechanical logic, and layered overlays of drive systems mapped onto human neural pathways. It was, to the untrained eye, gibberish, but to anyone who'd ever worked in deep-tech fusion labs or top-tier military R&D, it would have been undeniable. This was not repair work, this was reconstruction, blueprinting, innovation hidden in plain sight. Yet even Lena had her limits. The weight of the pattern, of giving everything and receiving nothing, wasn't without cost. Some nights she sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the bottom of her boots, wondering what it would take for them to finally see. Not just the machines she fixed, but the mind they kept misjudging. The ritual was supposed to be her shield, but lately it had begun to feel like a trap, like she had dug a trench for safety, only to find it filling slowly with regret. And then came the Humvee, the broken beast no one could tame. When she slid under that chassis and saw the design mirroring her old work, when her hand moved as if pulled by memory, sketching coordinates into steel, she knew the ritual was ending. She hadn't planned to leave a signature. She hadn't meant to draw attention. But some patterns weren't just cycles. Some were signals. And this one, drawn with spine-coordinated encryption under the frame of a military vehicle, was the first true break in the silence. Colonel DeSanti had seen it, and the ritual, so long established, so carefully maintained, had finally been disrupted. The question now wasn't whether Lena would be noticed. It was what would happen when they finally understood who she really was and what she had never stopped building. The rain poured down in heavy, relentless sheets, turning the motor pool grounds into a swamp of oil-streaked puddles and soggy dirt. Temperatures dropped sharply with the wind, but Alma remained beneath the lifted hood of the Humvee, sleeves rolled and knuckles scraped raw from hours of mechanical struggle. Her soaked coveralls clung to her frame like a second skin, but her mind was far from the discomfort of the weather. She was lost in a trance, tracing the tangled path of misfiring signals in the vehicle's onboard control module. The problem wasn't mechanical. Not entirely. It was in the software configuration, a fault in the wiring translation of the new comms system someone had spliced in without verifying compatibility. She'd seen this kind of sloppiness before, but the deeper issue was the attitude that allowed it. Someone assumed a quick patch job would pass, and Alma knew that someone assumed no one like her would ever catch it. But she did, and she was going to fix it. What she didn't expect was that the colonel was watching her from the hangar doorway the entire time. Colonel Braxton had only intended to pass through. He was overseeing an upcoming operation requiring all the base's armored transports, and he was told 3 Humvees were down due to electrical faults. Standard procedure. He'd expected the mechanics to be in motion, maybe a few working under hoods or running diagnostics. What he didn't expect was to find one woman, elbow deep in one of the oldest models, working solo in a thunderstorm, oblivious to everything but the circuitry in front of her. Something about her focus struck him immediately. She wasn't fiddling around or killing time. She was dissecting that machine with an intensity that reminded him of someone searching for a code inside a locked vault. He walked closer, boots splashing into the rising puddles, rain coating his polished cap. Alma didn't notice him right away, and he didn't announce himself. He simply watched her tug out a faulty resistor, replace it with one she retrieved from her chest pocket like she'd planned it, and then run a ground test sequence by memory. She spoke softly to herself, lines of code, logic paths, power loops, as if speaking the vehicle back to life. Then the dashboard lights flickered, blinked twice, and glowed steady. That's when Braxton spoke. The sound of his voice jolted Alma like a short circuit. She stood at attention reflexively, her hair clinging to her temples and a wrench still in her hand. Braxton looked at her name patch, then back at the Humvee. His questions were precise. What had caused the fault? How had she isolated it? How long had it taken her to fix it? She answered clearly and efficiently, not over-explaining but not underplaying her steps either. When she mentioned she had created a spine coordinate map of the Humvee's internal comms flow, her own visual system to track and predict system failures, he asked to see it. Alma hesitated, not because she didn't want to show it, but because no one had ever asked to see it before, not even her direct supervisors. She jogged to the locker room, pulled out her waterproof notebook, and handed it to the colonel. Inside were pages and pages of hand-drawn diagrams, color-coded circuits, overlapping data flows, annotations, margins filled with probability logs, and projected fault cycles. Braxton turned the pages slowly, each one revealing another layer of depth and foresight. These weren't doodles. These were systems intelligence maps. Alma wasn't just maintaining vehicles. She was engineering reliability out of chaos. He closed the notebook and looked at her, not with disbelief, but with the recognition of a force quietly sharpening itself beneath neglect. He asked her one last question. Why hadn't she submitted this method to Engineering Command? Alma shrugged. She said no one had asked. No one seemed interested in what a junior maintenance tech had to say about fleet coordination. Braxton didn't smile, but something in his eyes shifted. He told her to get cleaned up and report to command briefing the next morning at 0700. He didn't explain why. Alma stood there in the storm, unsure if she'd just been reprimanded or promoted. But she followed orders, as always. That night, in the dim yellow light of the barracks hallway, she sat on the edge of her bunk with the notebook in her hands, flipping through her own work for the first time, as if seeing it through someone else's eyes. It had always been her secret language, her attempt to wrestle patterns out of entropy. But maybe it was more. Maybe someone had finally seen the value of what she carried in her head. The next morning, as the base stirred into its usual rhythm of drills, chow lines, and clipped commands, Alma walked into the command briefing room with her heart hammering. She was the only enlisted technician in the room, surrounded by officers, software engineers flown in from sector units, and logistics planners. Braxton nodded at her when she entered, then gestured for her to approach the central table. Laid out before them were logistics sheets, tactical maps, and failure projections for the upcoming Armored Division exercise. One Humvee alone failing would delay the mission. Braxton opened her notebook and slid it onto the center of the table. He told everyone they were going to start using spine coordinates, and Alma would be leading the orientation. For 2 days, the workshop was unusually quiet. The usual clamor of tools clanking and shouted jokes had given way to an odd silence, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the dust to settle from what had happened. Kiara showed up every morning, early as always, and left late, just like she always had. But this time she carried herself with a deliberate calmness that was sharper than anger and colder than hurt. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, and that realization seemed to shake the very foundation of the motor pool's unspoken hierarchy. She didn't gloat or throw anyone's words back at them. She didn't change her tone or posture. She just kept doing her work, thorough, efficient, and precise. That, in itself, was what rattled them most. She didn't have to act differently to make them feel their own smallness. Captain Lott, whose face turned tomato red the day the colonel spoke up in Kiara's defense, barely looked her in the eye now. He walked with a newfound stiffness, often delegating tasks he would normally bark about just to avoid crossing her path. Rumors flew through the base like wildfire. Some said Colonel Berenger had personally sent Kiara's file to command to recommend her for officer school. Others whispered that she'd been recruited by a special ops engineering unit because of her Humvee modifications. Most didn't know the truth, but all of them now spoke her name with a cautionary edge, like she was someone you didn't want to underestimate. Kiara, meanwhile, was working on something else entirely. In the evenings, while the others were out drinking or playing cards, she remained behind in the hangar, refining the spine coordinates concept that had piqued the colonel's interest. What had started as a technique to stabilize weight distribution in damaged vehicles had become something more, almost like a living system. She was building a prototype on one of the shelled-out recon units they used for training. It was a Humvee frame that had seen better days, but it still had the core chassis intact. Her theory was that if you could create an internal skeletal structure that mirrored the balance system of the human spine, the vehicle could maintain integrity under blast force or heavy torque. It wasn't just about battlefield repairs anymore, it was about evolution, about resilience. It was in one of these late-night sessions, lit only by the flickering yellow of overhead lamps and the soft humming of the air vents, that Kiara received an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Duval stepped into the bay, hesitated, then cleared his throat. His usual smugness had been stripped away, replaced by something unfamiliar: humility. He said he'd been watching, said he didn't know what to think when she first showed up, and that the guys gave him a hard time too when he started, just for being book-smart. But he admitted he'd never seen anyone turn a theory into something so physical, something that made sense in the language of torque and steel. Kiara didn't say much. She handed him a socket wrench and pointed to the frame. Without asking, he dropped his duffel and joined her. They worked in silence, but the kind of silence that builds something, not the kind that suffocates. Slowly, one by one, more mechanics began stopping by. At first, just out of curiosity, then to offer a tool, then to ask a question, then to stay. By the end of the week, she had half the crew helping her on their off hours, not because they had to, because they wanted to learn. Even Lieutenant Murch, the logistics officer, stopped by with printouts from a recent military R&D journal, suggesting structural polymers that might work with her skeletal frame concept. He'd seen the footage Colonel Berenger had shown higher-ups. Kiara didn't know there had been footage. Apparently, her repair under pressure, done with nothing but raw parts, ingenious under fire, had made its way into a development meeting at the Pentagon. Berenger hadn't exaggerated his belief in her. He had been planning something bigger the entire time. Then came the official orders. Not a rumor, not speculation, but a sealed file handed to her by a courier with the Department of Defense insignia on his sleeve. She was being transferred, temporarily, to Fort Axiom, a secretive installation deep in the Nevada desert. The project was called Titan Spine, a new generation of military vehicle design. They wanted her on the think tank, not just for her hands, but for her mind. Her name had been hand-signed in recommendation by Colonel Berenger himself. The rest of the unit gathered around her as she packed up her tools. No one said much at first, just offered nods, quiet claps on the back, and a few too proud to apologize grins. But it was enough. Even Lot, red-eared and awkward, muttered something about proving him wrong, and nodded in a way that almost resembled respect. Sergeant Duval handed her a custom toolkit, etched with her name and unit number, a gift from the entire team. She took it without words, her throat too tight to speak. These weren't the same people who had mocked her for lifting an engine block or daring to know more than them, and she wasn't the same woman who had walked into that bay weeks ago, carrying nothing but her name, her hands, and the scars of everything she'd already survived. As the base gates opened and her transport pulled away into the horizon, Kiara looked back once, just once, not out of sentiment, but recognition, the kind you give a battlefield that shaped you, a forge that burned you clean. She wasn't done fighting, but now she wouldn't be fighting just for herself. She was building the next evolution, and this time no one would laugh. Not if they saw what her spine coordinates were about to become. The base quieted in the late hours, But in that stillness, a storm brewed inside every corner of Reagan's world. Each step toward her bunk felt heavier than the last, weighted by stares that clung to her back, whispers that trailed behind her like thorns, and an exhaustion that no sleep could cure. She had tried, endlessly, to prove herself through labor, logic, and loyalty, yet somehow it was never enough. At night, she would stare at the creaking ceiling fan, letting it blur as her eyes watered, not from weakness but from the soul's fatigue, the kind born from being doubted day after day. Every wrench turn she made on that Humvee seemed to trigger a new rumor or a fresh insult. She was mocked not only for being a woman but for being smarter than what they expected, as if having a spine built on mathematical intuition and mechanical precision was somehow offensive to the order of things. She wasn't trying to stand above them, she only wanted to stand with them. But that seemed more impossible with each passing day. A week after the colonel's silent observation, nothing changed on the surface. No memo came, no announcement, not even a single word from Colonel Ferris himself. It was as though the moment had vanished into the air, meaningless in the grand scheme of the base's hierarchy. But Reagan could feel a shift, subtle and crawling under the current of things. Captain Larson no longer barked at her with quite the same venom. The men at her side still chuckled when she brought out her measuring tools or noted torque specifications, but they seemed to do it less out of spite now and more out of habit. Change, if it was coming, moved like molasses, and yet something inside her stirred. Not hope exactly, but a readiness. Maybe, just maybe, the moment had planted a seed. She couldn't afford to water it with too much belief yet. She'd been burned by false starts before. Then came the second field exercise. It was a night maneuver, convoy run, simulated under combat conditions, terrain riddled with potholes, ditches, and soft soil. It was grueling, even on perfectly maintained vehicles, and everyone knew their trucks were long overdue for deep diagnostics. But time was a luxury, and budgets were stretched thin. Reagan had personally inspected 5 of the 7 vehicles in their fleet, working overtime in the bay without anyone asking. Her own quiet rebellion against the mediocrity expected of her. The 6th vehicle, a Humvee known as Echo 2, had been passed off as reliable by another mechanic earlier that week. She didn't trust that call, but she was told to back off. It wasn't hers to touch. Midway through the exercise, Echo 2 buckled. The front axle fractured against a slope, and the steering column locked with the driver trapped inside. The team scrambled in the dark, radios flaring with static and fragmented orders. No one could get close to the engine block without risking a full lockup. It was Reagan who arrived last. Her own Humvee had been delayed by a miscommunication in dispatch. But when she stepped onto the scene and saw the state of the vehicle, she didn't hesitate. Others fumbled with flashlights and muttered expletives, but she saw what they didn't. The shadow pattern under the body told her all she needed to know. The weld joint had cracked under heat stress, something she'd warned about during training weeks ago, and the cooling line had been rigged incorrectly. One wrong move would send hydraulic fluid across the system and jam every sensor. She climbed under the vehicle with no gloves, only a small headlamp and a single word murmured under her breath: precision. It wasn't bravery that moved her. It was muscle memory. Every torque value, every spline position, every contingency drilled in her mind like coordinates on her spine. This wasn't guesswork. It was trust in the blueprint. In under 10 minutes, she had rerouted the cable circuit manually, reset the safety lock, and redirected the stress valve pressure using only a rusted wrench and a pair of zip ties from her pocket. When she emerged, blackened with grease and soaked in sweat, she didn't wait for praise. She simply nodded at the driver, who blinked in stunned silence as the ignition light blinked back to life. But someone else had seen it all. Colonel Ferris had arrived quietly during the chaos, assessing the convoy from a ridge. He had watched her work not through a scope, but with field binoculars, and the careful eyes of someone who had once been underestimated himself. When the crew returned to base hours later, the colonel didn't call her in. Instead, he summoned the entire mechanical division and rewrote the inspection protocols in front of them. From now on, all field diagnostics were to be cross-checked with the Reagan metrics, a term he coined on the spot, etched into policy with the stroke of a pen and the authority of someone who'd seen enough to know genius when it roared beneath a layer of dust and discipline. Reagan heard about the order secondhand. At first, she thought it was a joke, some new way to mock her behind her back. But when the printed documents hit the bulletin board, and the technical manual was updated with excerpts from her personal notes, copied without error, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Not joy, not pride, just disbelief. She had been screaming into the void for so long that the echo had become her only companion. But now, the void had answered back with policy. The very spine of her knowledge had become law. She didn't tell anyone how she felt. She just tightened her ponytail, slid her wrench back into its holster, and went back to work. Because the work wasn't done, it was only beginning. By the time the convoy left Outpost Lima Bravo the next morning, something had changed in the air. Not the heat or the smell of diesel or the distant thud of chopper blades, but something internal, invisible, a quiet sense of recalibration in the minds of those who had witnessed Lena crawl under that Humvee and transform disdain into silence. Word had traveled fast. Not just about the repair, but about the moment Colonel Ambrose had crouched beside her and asked her about her coordinate etching system, the cryptic patterns no one else had bothered to ask about. That encounter had left the entire base buzzing with curiosity. Soldiers who previously ignored her now watched her with a strange mixture of skepticism and respect, waiting to see if what they'd heard was real or just another story distorted in the echo chamber of the barracks. But Lena wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about angles, steel tension, and the stress fracture she spotted last night in the rear axle of the M117 that had passed inspection. She filed the memory away with a mental tag, monitor, medium priority. She sat in the back of the transport as they rumbled across the cracked clay road, her fingers twitching involuntarily with the phantom memory of tools. Not fear, not anxiety, just a need to feel the texture of her work in her hands, to keep her mind aligned with the machinery that felt more honest than people ever had. Across from her sat Sergeant Webb, who hadn't said much since the incident yesterday, but now he kept glancing at her with a brow furrowed deep enough to hold suspicion and a dash of something else, uncertainty. They all had seen that the colonel hadn't just praised her. He had taken her aside for nearly 15 minutes afterward, not in reprimand, but in discussion. And when the colonel talks, people listen. Lena noticed the subtle shift in how she was treated when they stopped for a brief refuel. No one shoved past her. Someone even asked her opinion about an overheating issue in their LMTV engine, pretending like it was just curiosity. But Lena could read between the lines. They wanted to test the stories. As they reached the staging zone near the border ridge, trouble began brewing faster than anyone had anticipated. The forward scout unit had run into terrain complications that made mobility near impossible for the heavier vehicles. The engineer's diagnostics software was offline due to a misconfigured antenna array, and field adjustments had to be made manually. Lena, who hadn't even been asked to assist, had already slipped out of the transport and was kneeling beside the satellite transmitter before anyone noticed she was gone. She wasn't being insubordinate, she just saw that time wasn't on their side. Within minutes, she had bypassed the faulty output channel, rerouted the frequency path, and hardwired a temporary loop that brought the signal back online at 84% strength. Enough to run the system. When Captain Hillstrom arrived on scene and demanded to know who had tampered with the transmission, he found Lena standing there with dirt-smudged fingers and the diagnostic display blinking green. He opened his mouth, probably ready to snap, but the words died in his throat. Everyone could see the result. He narrowed his eyes and muttered, "Who authorized you?" Lena calmly handed him the printout, showing the timestamp, fix log, and power restoration sequence she'd just initiated. Protocol 7BF allows for emergency manual override if system downtime exceeds 30 minutes, she said, steady as stone. And just like that, another crack formed in the wall that had kept her on the outside. The mission proceeded. The convoy established the outpost perimeter, sensors deployed, transport routes logged. By sunset, the unit was settled in, at least temporarily. But for Lena, that day had shifted something far more important than any satellite dish. When she returned to her bunk, she found a folded note on her cot. It wasn't signed, but inside, in scrawled capital letters, were 4 words. "We saw. Keep going." She didn't need a signature to know who it came from. And she didn't need applause. That wasn't her fuel. The note was enough. But as night fell, an unplanned challenge emerged, one that would push Lena further than any schematic or field repair ever had. A storm system rolled in fast from the west, stronger than predicted. And by midnight, their communications unit had gone completely dark again. The repair she had made earlier had held, but the storm had shifted something in the upper tower mount. Worse, one of the drones they had launched for terrain mapping had not returned, and the command team needed its telemetry data to assess the safety of their next move. If they didn't retrieve it or access its signal, they'd be flying blind across hostile terrain come morning. No one volunteered. The storm was violent, with slicing wind and unpredictable gusts that made movement on foot risky. Lena was already moving before the question was finished being asked. Climbing the tower in that wind felt like scaling a metal skeleton in the middle of a hurricane. Every bolt and joint groaned beneath her. She had strapped herself in with a secondary harness hooked into the railing, but each movement required balance, foresight, and raw stubbornness. She didn't look down. She didn't think about the dozens of boots on the ground, watching her with breath held, half expecting her to fall. She didn't even think about the why, only the next bolt, the next grip, the next recalibrated anchor. When she reached the top, she held on with one hand and reattached the dish with the other, the wind slamming her like a wall of fists. But her spine held. Her coordinates, mental, emotional, physical, were locked in. She descended after nearly half an hour, soaked, shaking, but grinning for the first time in days. The tower blinked green, the drone pinged back, and in the command center, someone whispered what everyone else was already thinking. That wasn't just guts, that was engineering. Hein. By morning, Colonel Ambrose would issue an internal memo titled Asset Redeployment, Field Priority Specialist Lena Rourke. And under his breath, he'd mutter to his adjutant, "The girl who wrote blueprints on her spine just rebuilt the backbone of this unit." As dawn broke over Fort Denning, the thick fog that had blanketed the base all night began to lift, revealing the rhythmic bustle of another military day. But for Ava, the world had changed overnight. The events of the previous day still echoed loudly in her mind. The colonel's piercing gaze as he stared at her hand-drawn schematics, his silence that somehow carried more weight than any barked order, and the stunned expressions of the men who had once sneered at her presence in the motor pool. Yet what kept her awake the entire night wasn't the attention or even the validation. It was what came next. The colonel hadn't simply taken her schematics with a vague promise. He'd issued a directive that changed everything. She was to report to the Innovation and Tactical Engineering Division by 0700. That meant stepping into the highest-level think tank the base had, normally reserved for top-tier engineers, experienced tacticians, and veterans with decades under their belts. And now a young mechanic with grease-stained coveralls and a broken spine fused with steel and determination was to be among them. Ava stood before the mirror in her quarters, her hair still damp from the shower, her reflection both familiar and strange. She had always carried herself with quiet confidence, but there was something else now, an edge in her posture, a readiness. Her eyes weren't looking for approval anymore. They were focused, intense, as if finally given permission to be what they had always been capable of. She slid into her uniform, tucked in the crisp edges, and clipped her name badge onto the pocket, like she'd done 1,000 times before. But this time, the name wasn't just a formality. It carried weight. It carried proof. By the time she arrived at the ITE division building, a structure that looked more like a research facility than a military office, she was already the subject of hushed conversations. Engineers in pressed shirts and officers with laptops glanced at her as she walked past security, her presence causing a ripple through the otherwise calculated atmosphere. A staff sergeant escorted her to the conference room where she was told she'd be introduced. The room was already filled. Around a sleek table sat some of the sharpest minds on base, men and women who had created tactical drone algorithms, AI targeting overlays, armored reinforcements, and unbreakable battlefield logistics systems. At the head of the table stood Colonel Riker, reviewing a projection of Ava's spine coordinates concept blown up on the digital screen. Ava's feet hesitated for a moment, heart pounding. Then Riker turned, his gravel, rough voice cutting through the low murmurs. "She's here," he said simply. All heads turned. For a beat, the room fell into a silence that carried tension and curiosity in equal parts. Ava stepped in. Riker didn't waste time. "Mechanic Ava Green," he said, "is the mind behind this adaptive suspension and predictive repair matrix. I asked her to join us because what she's developed isn't just impressive, it has field-saving potential, and if we're smart, we won't waste it." The murmurs began again, but this time they were different, less dismissive, more intrigued. Ava was handed a digital stylus and motioned toward the screen. She explained, slowly at first, then with growing clarity and precision, how the coordination system she had mapped using her spine wasn't just metaphorical. It mirrored the human body's feedback system in a way that could be applied to machinery, especially machinery deployed in unpredictable terrain like the Humvee or the newer assault transports. The room leaned in. One by one, questions flew, high-level, technical, detailed, and Ava caught each one, broke it down, answered with clarity. She referenced shock resistance data, showed mock-ups for embedded feedback loops that could predict damage and reroute systems before failure, and proposed an interface upgrade that would streamline diagnostics down to a wrist monitor. By the time she finished, even the most skeptical engineer in the room was nodding. Colonel Riker gave her a long, unreadable stare, then spoke to the group. "I'm tasking this room with fast-tracking this prototype into field testing. Ava will serve as design liaison and system integrity consultant." The words settled like thunder. The term consultant might not have seemed extraordinary to anyone outside, but in this room, among these minds, it meant one thing. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was a key voice. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed and assignments were handed out, Riker approached her again. He didn't say much, just offered a simple, "Well done," before walking off. But that was all she needed. In that moment, Ava didn't feel like she had arrived. She felt like she had finally been seen. Later that day, as she walked back to the motor pool to gather her tools and say goodbye to the old workspace that had been both her sanctuary and her battleground, she found herself pausing at the entrance. The same men who had once dismissed her now stood in a loose group, watching her approach. There was no mockery this time, just quiet acknowledgement. One of them, Jenkins, gave her a nod that was stiff but genuine. "Heard you're going full-time brain trust now," he said, not quite smiling but close. Ava shrugged, a small grin tugging at her lips. "Guess they finally figured out grease monkeys can think too." The others chuckled, low and awkward, but not unkind. As she turned away, one of them called out, "Hey, Green, knock 'em dead." Ava didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because for the first time, she was walking forward into a world that had once shut its doors, but now it had no choice but to open them wide. The desert sun scorched the tarmac as Lena stood with grease-stained hands, watching the last of the convoy disappear beyond the outer fence. They had driven off without her again, Even after the report she filed detailing how the rear brake on Humvee Delta 3 needed a full pad replacement, not a patch job. But no one had listened, or rather, they had heard, rolled their eyes, and left her with one more example of how protocol in a place like this was often eclipsed by pride, ego, or plain negligence. She clenched her jaw, recalling how Jenkins and Noto chuckled when she tried to explain the torque drop she'd noticed in the rear axle during a test drive. "Pretty sure you just need to let the car warm up, sweetheart." Jenkins had smirked, flicking his wrench like it was a baton in a show. It wasn't about her being new anymore. It was about the fact that she saw things others didn't want to. And no matter how carefully she presented her case, or how accurately her diagnostics lined up, it was like she had to work twice as hard to earn half the trust. Back inside the garage bay, the only shade available came from the wide mouth of the corrugated steel hanger. Lena grabbed her tablet from the cart and began pulling up the system logs for the Delta Series vehicles. She wasn't scheduled to work today, but she had begun doing this often, checking diagnostics, cross-referencing small anomalies in performance metrics, and uploading preventative maintenance reports. She wasn't being asked to. No one even noticed. But she was starting to track a pattern that unnerved her. The electronic braking system software was glitching when the vehicles hit 55 miles per hour under full load. Not every time, but enough to raise a red flag. Most dismissed it as driver error or poor terrain, but Lena saw the correlation. The GPS coordinates synced with the momentary system freeze, were always on an incline, and occurred during heat spikes, which triggered an outdated cooling command in the software that hadn't been updated in months. She cross-checked again and noticed that BRAV-05, another vehicle in today's convoy, had the same version installed. Her heart quickened. They were driving into the canyons. Those inclines were brutal even on foot, and if the EBS glitched there, it could cause a rollover. She pulled up the field contact directory and tried radioing the convoy lead, but the connection crackled and dropped. Of course. That route was notorious for dead zones. Without wasting another second, Lena sprinted to the side unit where the base communications officer, Sergeant Calhoun, was posted. He looked up lazily as she burst in, eyes scanning her with annoyance. "Need a priority override," she said, out of breath. "One of the Humvees in Convoy 4 has faulty software and might fail on the Canyon Pass. I have data to back it." He raised an eyebrow but didn't move. "You're not even on shift." "Doesn't matter. If they go past Checkpoint Sierra without updating the firmware, they're at risk." He sighed, muttered something about technicians thinking they ran the world, and slowly keyed into his terminal. Lena handed him her report. She expected more pushback, but maybe it was the urgency in her voice, or the rapidly growing sense of tension that even he could feel. 30 minutes later, after a painful wait, the relay came back. Convoy 4 had hit the incline, and sure enough, Bravo 5's brakes had locked for a terrifying 3 seconds before rebooting. The driver managed to keep control, but just barely. When the convoy returned, the lead colonel, Quentin Harrow, personally called for an incident report. That's when Lena's name came up. At first, she thought she was being summoned to be reprimanded. Another round of being told to stay in her lane. But Colonel Harrow wasn't interested in punishing anyone. Instead, he wanted her to walk him through the full diagnostic trail she had built. She showed him the GPS tag data, the temperature sinks, the EBS freeze logs, and the firmware patch she had already drafted as a solution. He sat back, arms crossed, but his expression shifted from skepticism to something close to admiration. "Where'd you learn to do this kind of spatial log correlation?" he finally asked. Lena explained her side hobby, mapping vehicle diagnostics like heat maps, overlaying them with topography models, and analyzing machine behavior the way meteorologists tracked weather systems. It wasn't standard procedure, but it worked, and in this case, it probably saved lives. Word traveled fast, faster than Lena expected. Within days, she was asked to join a task force dedicated to overhauling the vehicle safety systems. Not just as a mechanic, but as an analyst. The laughers, Jenkins, Noto, Even the indifferent Sergeant Calhoun had gone quiet, not because they were embarrassed, but because something shifted in their perception. For the first time, Lena wasn't just tolerated, she was trusted. It was strange to walk through the garage and feel heads nod in silent respect instead of disdain. Even stranger was the invitation to speak at the quarterly safety review with the base command team. She wore her uniform-like armor that day, not to protect herself from ridicule, but because it finally felt earned. The colonel introduced her by title, but ended with something that stuck with her. "What Lena found," he said, "wasn't just a glitch in a machine, it was a gap in how we listen. She didn't just fix the system, she showed us how to think again." Still, Lena knew this was just one battle. The old ways didn't vanish overnight. But she had planted a flag. One based not on defiance or anger, but precision, consistency, and an unshakable belief that doing what's right wasn't always about rank or rules. Sometimes, it came down to recognizing a spine of coordinates in a landscape others had overlooked. And once seen, it could never be unseen. That alone made all the laughter worth enduring. The base awoke to an unusual stillness that morning, one thick with the anticipation of something brewing beneath the surface. The motor pool had never been cleaner, nor the mechanics more alert, but it wasn't because of orders or inspections. No, it was because of the way word had spread about the colonel's interest in Lily Vargas. The mechanics didn't know what to expect anymore. Where once there had been sneering comments and eye rolls every time she rolled under a Humvee or hauled a transmission, there was now silence. Some of them still held resentment, others confusion, but no one dared speak it aloud. Not after what Colonel Bramwell had said in the meeting. Not after she corrected the logistics diagram in front of him and rewired that faulty circuit board like it was as simple as braiding her hair. Lily herself didn't change much outwardly. She still showed up early, still worked harder than anyone, and still kept her focus squarely on the vehicles. But something inside her had shifted. There was a weight off her chest now, a quiet pride that moved with her steps. She wasn't walking into a war anymore. She was walking into purpose. What she didn't know was that the real test was yet to come. That week, the base received intel that a critical supply route through the mountain passes had been sabotaged. Several Humvees en route to deliver munitions to an Allied outpost had stalled, leaving the drivers stranded in a high-risk zone known for ambushes. A rapid response team was needed to recover the vehicles and, more importantly, secure the supplies. Mechanics were being rotated into field operations for hands-on support, and to everyone's shock, Lily was selected for the team. Some whispered that it was Bramwell pulling strings, but he had made it clear in front of the senior staff that Lily's assessment scores were among the highest and her field simulations unmatched. She wasn't there because she was a woman. She was there because she was damn good. Still, as she suited up in her dusty fatigues and secured her gear, she couldn't shake the nerves gnawing at her stomach. This wasn't a controlled garage. This was live combat territory. But fear had never stopped her before, and it wasn't going to start now. They deployed at dawn in a convoy of 6, weaving through narrow ridgelines and exposed valley roads. Dust clouded the air, baking under the searing heat, and the tension inside the trucks was electric. Lily sat beside Sergeant Kane, a hardened field vet who had once thrown a wrench across the garage after she'd corrected his torque setting. He hadn't spoken to her since, but now, he sat quietly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the dashboard, his glances sideways not filled with malice, but with curiosity. When they arrived at the disabled Humvees, they found the worst-case scenario. 2 were riddled with bullet holes, 1 axle was completely bent out of shape, and the last vehicle was wedged precariously against a ledge, threatening to fall if shifted improperly. The drivers had taken cover nearby and were uninjured, but the window for recovery was shrinking fast. Lily didn't wait for instructions. She scanned the terrain, assessed the damage, and immediately began to triage the scene. She directed Kane and another mechanic to begin extraction on the 3rd Humvee, while she tackled the one on the cliff edge. As she approached the vehicle hanging near the drop, the sheer risk of the operation became clear. The slightest miscalculation could send it tumbling down the ravine, and her with it. But what no one else knew was that Lily had trained for scenarios like this in secret. While everyone else was resting, she had studied engineering blueprints, memorized pulley dynamics, and even built scale models from spare parts to test terrain resistance. She anchored herself with nylon straps, attached a pulley to the undercarriage, and began carefully disassembling the weight distribution panel. Kane stood above her, radio in hand, and for the first time, he wasn't scoffing, he was watching, learning, respecting. The moments dragged on, sweat pooling down her back as she maneuvered against gravity and time. And then, finally, with a tense pull of the winch, the Humvee stabilized. It was safe to move. Applause broke out, not from protocol, but from raw relief and admiration. They secured all 3 vehicles and completed the supply drop just before sunset. When they returned to base, Colonel Bramwell was waiting. He didn't need to say much. Just a nod of recognition. That night, as Lily scrubbed the grease from her arms, exhausted but exhilarated, she found a folded note tucked into her tool bag. It wasn't signed, but she knew the handwriting. "You earned every second of that operation. I trust you with my team, and soon, maybe more than that." Her heart beat faster, not because of admiration, but because she realized something monumental. She had shifted the culture of the motor pool, not by demanding change, but by embodying it. Slowly, respect had replaced ridicule, questions had replaced insults, and leadership had replaced silence. But something else was about to happen. Something that would push Lily not just as a mechanic, not even as a woman in uniform, but as a strategist with a mind that would shape the very operations of the base. Because Colonel Bramwell wasn't just impressed, he was about to give her the kind of responsibility that no one else on base had dared to take. And it would all start with a blueprint she had secretly been working on, scribbled in the back of her engineering notebook, labeled only with 2 words, spinal coordinates. A system that, if implemented, could turn the tide of every logistics deployment in the field. The moment Captain Sofia Vargas set foot on the tarmac back in Nevada, the air felt different, not just in temperature or scent, but in weight. Something had shifted, and though her combat boots pressed against familiar soil, she carried the burden of unfamiliar power. In her duffel were schematics and prototype drafts from the Middle East, raw footage of tests run in sand-swept motor pools, and the sealed commendation letter from Colonel Harrow, with a Pentagon seal embossed in gold. A black SUV was already waiting for her, military-grade but civilian-registered, and the man inside, a quiet representative from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, offered her nothing but a nod and an envelope bearing her name. She didn't need to open it to know the next phase of her life had begun. The drive to the base was quiet, introspective. Through the window the desert horizon blurred, but her thoughts were razor-sharp. The mockery she had endured felt like a distant echo, one that no longer held power over her. From the jeers in boot camp to the whispers in engineering school, all had been silenced by the weight of results. And more than results, by vision, the kind that outlasts ridicule. At the Nevada base, she was directed to a special development hangar, one rarely used by standard personnel. The badge clipped to her chest granted her access to a new world, one where ideas weren't dismissed due to origin or gender, but rigorously stress-tested in high-stakes environments. Her first step into the hangar revealed a clean, metallic world of prototypes, curved interfaces, engineers in lab coats and camouflage alike, and on a distant platform, the skeleton of what would become the HVX Initiative, a next-gen armored vehicle that used her exact spinal mapping code as a neural sync template. The Colonel had greenlit the integration of the human-machine sympathetic reflex system she had conceived in theory and tested under duress. This was no longer just about Humvees. This was about reshaping the very relationship between soldier and machine. For days that bled into nights, Sofia immersed herself in the program's birth. She presented before 4-star generals, civilian defense executives, and a Pentagon review committee that grilled her with technical, ethical, and logistical questions. She answered them all with the same steadiness she had under mortar fire. She wasn't just defending her work. She was proving that the battlefield had evolved, and with it, the expectations of who could lead innovation. The breakthroughs mounted rapidly. Her reflex-responsive hydraulic joint system adapted to user feedback with record precision. Her custom-built microprocessor mimicked neural delay correction, allowing real-time adjustment between terrain feedback and steering corrections. But the real game-changer, the thing that had everyone on edge, was the spine mirroring harness. It could be adjusted for any user, male or female, with millimeter-specific control, enabling operators to feel the terrain in their bones, quite literally. But not everyone was ready to embrace it. The resistance came this time not in the form of crude remarks or dismissive glances, but in silence, budget redirection, and buried emails. A particular senior contractor, a former defense tech CEO turned consultant, made it clear during a closed-door session that he didn't think combat hardware needed to be so emotionally attuned to its driver. Sophia, noting his tight-lipped scoff, merely opened the footage from Mosul the moment she had maneuvered the compromised Humvee through rubble at night with her system, while another driver in a conventional rig had stalled twice under identical conditions. Numbers didn't lie. Emotion didn't cloud her data. It clarified it. Eventually, pressure mounted high enough that they could no longer afford to ignore the results. Sophia's prototype was moved from testing bay to field simulation. Her own squad from Fort Eisen, hand-picked this time, and gender-balanced, underwent training in the HVX with spinal harnesses. The initial feedback was staggering. Reduced driver fatigue by 47%, increased hazard awareness by over 60%, and near-instant reflex replication with lower long-term joint strain. Those who had previously dismissed her system now found themselves cornered by the efficacy they couldn't deny. The colonel, now retired but serving as an advisor, visited her in the hangar unannounced one early morning. He simply handed her a flash drive and said, "This has the coordinates of your legacy. No one laughs at it anymore." Inside the drive were encrypted coordinates and timestamps, data from multiple field units now using her tech in undisclosed operations. She wasn't just an engineer anymore. She was an architect of transformation. The weight she had carried, the spine that had been both her literal and symbolic backbone, was no longer a burden. It was a bridge. In a quiet moment of solitude, seated alone on a hangar step with a thermos of coffee in hand, Sophia allowed herself to breathe. She thought of her mother in Guatemala, who had once sewn together old military uniforms just to buy her daughter a second-hand laptop. She thought of Professor Leung, her engineering mentor, who once whispered, "They'll never expect you, and that's your weapon." She thought of the first time she was laughed at near that busted Humvee, and how the memory had been replaced by the roar of approval from a fully armed test crew running her system through desert terrain without a hitch. There was still more to prove. But the world was finally listening. She stood up, stretched her shoulders, and turned back toward the platform where the second prototype was nearly complete. They would test it in snow terrain next. Alaska. Another environment, another challenge, another chance to lead. This time, no one would dare question her presence. The ceremony was not just for decorum. It was a statement to the entire base, and perhaps the whole military network watching from afar. As Colonel Reeds took the podium and looked over the crowd of uniformed soldiers, technicians, officers, and trainees, a solemn silence swept over the parade grounds. Behind him, the newly restored Humvee stood like a statue, clean, functional, and poised. Right beside it was Isla, standing in full mechanic's uniform with grease still staining the cuffs, her name badge partially scorched from the heat of welding torches. The colonel began speaking not about protocol or command excellence, but about unseen potential, about hidden figures within systems too rigid to notice the genius in their midst. He spoke about how brilliance isn't always announced with a megaphone. Sometimes it comes in the form of a quiet woman covered in grime, scribbling spine coordinates on a napkin during lunch breaks, whispering innovations to herself under the hood of a dying machine. The audience listened, many embarrassed by their earlier dismissiveness, others simply awed that someone in their midst had accomplished what none of them had managed in years. Then came the moment that shifted Isla's entire life, the presentation of the Master Commendation Medal, a rarely awarded distinction reserved for acts of exceptional innovation and impact. It wasn't just a military nod of respect. It was a bridge to a future no one, not even Isla, had envisioned. Along with the medal, she was given the role of Chief Technical Strategist under a new division being launched jointly by the Department of Defense and a coalition of advanced research units. Her first project, designing a new fleet of off-grid tactical transport vehicles capable of both combat durability and stealth mobility across desert, tundra, and jungle terrains. Isla couldn't believe it. This was no longer just about fixing broken machines. It was about engineering the future of the military's backbone. After the ceremony, the line of people waiting to speak to her stretched longer than she anticipated. Many of them were soldiers who had laughed at her, now shaking her hand, some apologizing, others offering ideas to collaborate. Even Logan approached, a different look in his eyes. He didn't apologize, not in words, but the look of respect. The pride in his voice when he said, "You built a miracle," was enough for Isla. She didn't need groveling. She needed progress, and she had it now. Over the following weeks, Isla transitioned into her new role, her days filled with team briefings, lab visits, and test runs. She traded grease for blueprints, wrenches for digital simulators. She was now designing from the top down, mentoring young mechanics, inspiring female recruits, and building pathways for others like her, those who didn't fit molds but had minds bursting with ideas. She even launched a mentorship program specifically for women in the mechanical and technical fields of the armed forces. She called it the Isla Code, a nod to the spine coordinate system that had turned everything around. The program took off like wildfire. But Isla never lost her roots. Once a week, she returned to Bay 4, the dusty, sweat-soaked place where it all started. There, she'd help a trainee with an oil change, sketch ideas on napkins, and remind herself why she started in the first place. One afternoon, while walking past the now famous Humvee, she noticed someone had engraved something small near the back axle, just beneath the main chassis. It read, "They laughed until she rebuilt the road they walked on." No one claimed credit for it, but she suspected it was one of the junior mechanics she had helped during those long, hard months of ridicule. Back home in Westford, her mother had watched the entire ceremony broadcast online. Isla hadn't seen her since before the Humvee project began, and when she finally flew in for a weekend, her mother met her at the airport with tears in her eyes. She hugged her daughter tighter than she ever had, whispering, "Your father would have been so proud." Isla smiled, tears catching on her lashes, and whispered back, "I finally built something no one can take apart." As the months turned into a year, Isla became a symbol not only of perseverance, but of visionary leadership within systems designed to resist change. Her designs started being tested across international missions, her theories published in tactical engineering journals, and her story told to new recruits across all branches. She wasn't just the girl who fixed the Humvee anymore. She was the woman who rewrote the technical doctrine for combat resilience in the field. At her request, the original Humvee was never decommissioned or stored away. Instead, it remained on display at the Central Military Museum, along with Isla's original notebook, the one she'd scrawled her spine coordinates in, grease-stained and worn, a testament to what happens when conviction meets knowledge, when someone dares to keep showing up even when the world refuses to look up. Sinkum notebudge. And so, the woman they laughed at became the woman the world now listens to, not because she shouted to be heard, but because her work roared louder than any prejudice, any barrier, any chain of command. She didn't just repair the vehicle. She rebuilt the belief in what was possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.